Hi, Lucho. What's up?
Hey, Paula. Good morning to you. Good afternoon to me.
Yeah, we have a lovely sunset behind you.
Yes. It's been a beautiful summer day in Lima, Peru, where I'm based. So it's good to see you.
Lovely, good to see you too, as always. So what's the sentiment? How do you want to start talking about the situation? What's happening these days in copper?
I mean, I think everyone this week talked about the Glencore Teck potential deal, right? I mean, it's been talked about quite a bit. It's probably been overanalyzed to death, and still questions remain about whether Glencore is going to, increase their bid and what Teck is going to do and what the Teck shareholders are going to do regarding their own plans or their previous plans, and whether there's another group that's going to be interested among the majors, but that was sort of the culmination of a couple of weeks of news stories on the M&A side. I was particularly taken aback, surprised by the Lundin Caserones deal. First Quantum coming into Peru and acquiring a majority shareholding of La Granja from Rio Tinto also caught my attention. And there's a lot of other deals around. I mean, smaller deals, but obviously these are the ones that make the news and have been in the mouths of everyone. So, the copper market has been heating up for many months now, but it's really coming to a head. And the question is, where are we going now with the copper deals?
Yeah, it's I mean, I think it feels like suddenly the majors, obviously, especially because they are the ones that are holding the most cash. But like everybody, as we said, everybody wants copper. Like, okay, now we know. Now we are trying to start acting on the the looming shortage that is coming, because it's, if you don't explore as much, you're not going to find as much. And with the last decade having such a low discovery rate, so compared to the previous decade that was about 10 or so discoveries per year, falling to less than 2, it's it's significant. And yeah, I think everybody's sort of catching on. Okay, we're in trouble.
I mean, it's a little bit of a perfect storm, right? I mean, first of all, I mean, copper becoming one of the battery metals, or being so the electrification, if you will, being so copper intensive, is not new, right? You and I have been in the lithium business for a very long time. Way back then, we knew that the demand for lithium was going to be a lot bigger than what it was then. And it was the same for copper, right? I mean, someone sort of figured it out about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and all of a sudden, everyone's like, oh my God, copper, right? But you add to that, what you were saying. I mean, lower prices, higher costs, pandemic, social problems. I mean, in Chile, in Peru, et cetera, that have caused production disruptions. You've got a lot going on, right? And what people in the end need to realize is that the demand is clearly there, and these supply shortfalls are not going to change overnight. Okay, I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, from exploration to development, exploration, discovery, development, construction, production, you're talking about a lot of years, 10 plus years, easily. So that's not going to change, and I guess that's what's driving people to start looking at different transactions. But if we talk about the two transactions that I mentioned, Lundin, Caserones, and First Quantum coming into Rio Tinto La Granja in Peru, right? I mean, Caserones for a very long time has been a substandard asset, right? I mean, it not making good money, not meeting production guidelines, et cetera. I mean, today Caserones makes money because of where the copper price is, but it's not exactly an attractive asset. So, all of a sudden, independent of the price ticket, right? I mean, because that's in the end, that's what bankers are used for, but to justify. But I mean, independent of the price tag, it goes to show that, you know, the appetite for copper among those names that attract investors, such as the Lundin Group. I mean, you know, they're going to buy, you know, whatever assets are available, even if they're not tier one assets, if you will. No, First Quantum coming into Rio Tinto's La Granja. I mean, La Granja has been on standstill for the longest time. You know, in fact, I mean, Rio Tinto's not going. Sorry, First Quantum is not going to be spending too much money over the next couple of years because of, you know, of the stuff that needs to be done. But I mean, the Peruvian government always puts out this list of, you know, 10, 15 projects that are in the pipeline. La Granja is always there. Okay, yeah. It's been there forever, and it'll continue to be there forever. I mean, of those 10, 15, maybe I could name 3. And maybe that's the subject for another podcast. Okay, maybe I could talk about 3 that I think are going to see the light of the day, ever. Okay, so, you know, I understand that maybe for First Quantum it's about pipeline, and they want to access tier one assets, and at least the analyst reviews that I've seen on the deal are you know, quite optimistic, but. You know, I don't know how many people in Peru really believe that La Granja is going to ever get developed, to be honest. I mean, I think developing a project of that size in Peru today, with what Peru is going through and has been going through, I find it very difficult to believe that a project of that magnitude and that kind of history will actually see the light of day.
In the case of La Granja, I think at least what you read in the media and sort of inferred from some of the comments, it's Rio Tinto kind of trying to walk away, like, we can walk away a little bit so someone else can take the brunt of whatever happens. And they even say it's a complex deal, like not a complex deal, it's a complex asset or something like that. So, you know, they're obviously recognizing this is, you know, we're not sure if this is ever going to be a mine, which, you know, the reality is there's so many copper mines that we're not sure if they ever going to, you know, become a mine. Even the US has a bunch of those. And then First Quantum is trying to, you know, they've grown a lot since in the last decade, they've grown quite a bit. Years ago, they bought a big copper asset in Salta, one that we worked for a bit. My dad worked even more years before, Takataka. So they have a really nice group of assets, and they're trying to grow. And I think for them is a way to step up, you know, another step up, at least in resources. But obviously, the deal includes, like, if they get to, part of the deal is they have to do a feasibility study. So, and that's going to cost, you know, over $500 million. So I think it's the move is Rio Tinto wants to sort of the risks and sort of, you know, they have their hands full with Mongolia in the latest acquisition, you know, the turquoise, yeah. So I think that's kind of how I see it, at least. And in terms of the landing, so we've got, you know, one transaction focusing in Chile and the other transaction focusing in Peru. Do you think that, you know, the two jurisdictions are super mature and super, you know, good for copper, and they have issues, but they're very different issues. At least now, like, sort of the social situation has quite a bit in Chile, so that risk is not as high. But what do you think the interest for these companies, you know, looking at copper in Chile or copper in Peru, what would be your reason, or how do you justify doing one and not the other?
I mean, to be honest, Paula, you know, obviously mining is a long game, right? So I think when you're talking about, you know, Peru, Chile, pretty much all of South America, right? I mean, even Mexico right now with the latest announcements by López Obrador about changes in the mining law, Mexico becomes a bit of an issue, right? But these are all mining countries, right? And they will always be mining countries, and mining will be present there, here, for forever. I mean, for the foreseeable future, but I mean, I would say forever. So, the decisions are a bit temporary, right? I mean, and I think are more related to how quickly the project comes to fruition, right? I mean, if we talk specifically about Peru and what's going on the political side, I mean, things have quieted down on the political social side. I mean, the protests are over, but the situation is far from resolved, right? I mean, there's still this uncertainty. We don't know if the elections are going to be brought forward or not, et cetera. So, if you're going to live with that uncertainty, and the current president is going to stay for the next 4 years, that uncertainty is going to remain. And I'm not really sure if you have a multi-billion-dollar project, if you want to really start spending part of those multi-billion dollars when you have the uncertainty looming, right? So that uncertainty to a degree has lessened in Chile, but I mean, I think in Chile it's also a new era. The heyday of mining and stuff like that. I mean, it's not gone, but the rules of the game are different. I mean, they're higher taxes, profit participation, et cetera. I mean, that's bound to happen in future governments, right? But in the end, they're all going to be stable jurisdictions over the long term, and they continue to be very attractive projects, right? I mean, La Granja is an attractive project, okay? So, I think it's going to be a mixed ball.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they're long-term projects, long-term assets, and long-term development cycles, it just means that investors in general, not just the sophisticated or corporates that are trying to develop these assets, but also the retail investors that are trying to participate in this sector, they kind of need to adjust to a longer time frame and sort of just adjust expectations in that sense, I guess.
For investors, but also for the sellers, Paola. Till January, I was working on a transaction here in Peru for an operating copper mine. Call it, I mean, if you compare it to Lundin, to Caserones or La Granja, I mean, it's on the smallish side, but call it a $200 million acquisition, okay, on an operating copper mine. The main risks on that transaction as we got to the end of the year were, will the buyer be able to raise the equity needed? Okay, that sort of disappeared in the first quarter because the equity markets opened up, particularly for copper. But the structure of the acquisition was a bit complicated, okay, and it included some cash, mostly shares, some contingent payments, and debt involved, etc. And I think that in the end, the deal fell through, okay, and I think it fell through for two reasons. I mean, one, the structure wasn't fantastic, and that probably gave the seller second thoughts. And number two, the copper price starting to move up, and that interest, really, that the sentiment was there last year, but now it's really heating up, right? That sentiment is becoming a reality. I think the seller got cold feet and basically said, what? I think I'm going to stick around with this asset for a while, because when I first of all, I mean, if I'm the seller, I mean, I try to sell this around this time last year when I started my sales process, and there were interested parties, but I expected to get a big check up front, and that didn't happen, right? And in the end, I ended up in a structure that wasn't ideal. I would have liked a cleaner structure for my exit. and maybe the seller thinks that he's going to get that now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is that I do think people are going to pay up for copper assets, particularly if they're operating and they have a reasonable reserve life, and particularly if they have growth potential. But they're not going to go crazy, right? I mean, financing is still going to be tough to come by, right? As you said, when you're talking about the bigger guys, I mean, they have cash and they can make commitments and stuff like that. But for the mid-size, the smaller size, they don't necessarily have a war chest to go out and shop around. And the sellers need to understand that, structuring and financing are always going to be key here, right? I mean, if you go out for bank financing, banks are not going to use $4.50 in their price deck for calculating your debt capacity, right? They might use 4, but they're most likely going to use 375, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking that. Yeah,
it's a banker's job is not to be,
optimistic.
A price risk taker, if you will.
Yeah,
exactly. A price risk taker, right? I mean, they're not there to finance hoping that the price is going to go up. They're there to finance something that's going to be around if prices do go down. We get $10,000 copper last year, and then it went back down. Right?
No, exactly. I mean, you're developing an asset and you want to be optimistic, but at the same time, if you're not realistic, so you have to combine the two. If you're not realistic, you're gonna get. And we've seen cases now, like, oh no, we have to shut down. We'll be in care and maintenance for now because, and you want to minimize the potential, risk for that as much as you can. So, I think it's a wise, assumption that it's realistic, but at the same time, and this is just a brief mention. I've seen sort of other assumptions that may be a little bit too conservative. Yeah, you want to make sure that you have some realistic view on the growth of the commodity, because anyway, we're gonna get into a whole thing, and we can leave that because that's more related to lithium. So we'll talk about that in the next one. Okay, so and now we also said the last bit for this session is going to be some juicy rumors that we've been hearing because of the work that we do. We obviously and we'll never mention names because we can't, but we can say a little bit of the crime, but not the culprit. So one well, sometimes you can say if it's a public rumor we can say it, but if it's private we can't. We wanted to cover. How do you want to cover the first one? How do you want to start with this? Well, the second one. The second one.
I mean, because we've been doing some work on the copper side here. We've kept our ear to the ground. I mean, not only because of the transaction that we were doing, but we've been keeping our ear to the ground. And it did surprise me that one of the larger copper players around, in fact, one of the ones that we've been mentioning at the beginning of this call, was actually selling one of their operating copper assets in Peru. It surprised me a little bit because even though it's an asset that is not a tier 1, and this company likes to have tier 1s and has been going after, growing their copper business on the tier 1. It's a pretty steady asset. Let's put it this way. I mean, I think the acquisition or the acquisition price for that asset or the value of that asset is anywhere between $1 and $1.5 billion, right? So it's not a small asset. It's got a relatively long life, and it surprised me. It surprised me that that this group would potentially be selling it because it's already a mature asset. I mean, if in a moment of these copper prices, but then again, they are in the hot zone of Peru, you know, with some of the bigger social issues, etc. So that might give them, that might be giving the group, you know, some second thoughts about why, you know, whether they would keep this asset. But you know, that the point is, Paula, that there seems to be a lot going on. Okay, I mean, there are assets, polymetallic and copper assets, mid-sized, that are for sale, and people are looking at, and there's, you know, some are being run by processes with investment banks, and others are just, you know, sort of running their own process. But there is movement in the market.
To give a little bit of a indication of appetite, so we're seeing the appetite in corporates are not currently active in copper, so they're trying to get into copper. When we're seeing groups like that, we've been talking to a Middle Eastern group as well, you know, with you guys, and it's interesting to see that when they're opportunistic. So they're saying that, okay, so this is a long-term game. We know it's a long-term game, and we want to go into these places where we know eventually things are going to get better. Now they're a little bit riskier than they were in the past. So we're going to get a better valuation, and they're being opportunistic about that. So we're seeing a lot of that happening, right? So that's interesting.
And I think, I mean, you know, either for new groups, because as you said, I mean, there are newer groups that want to get into the copper business because they see the long-term play, but also for existing groups that want to grow. Okay, I mean, I think that Peru and Chile are always going to be go-to places in Latin America to look for projects, because you still have them, in operation, etc. But I think they're also going to need to start looking at advanced development projects, and at some point even go down the scale. And, you know, exploration is still dead. Okay, I mean, the exploration market is still dead, and you don't have big exploration projects right now, right out there. I mean, you don't have very many out there. So and no one wants to spend, you know, tens of millions of dollars in drilling while this copper cycle sort of passes you. But, you know, it is what it is. I mean, I do think that they need to go a bit smaller, and take a look at the you know, advanced development projects that have an upside, etc., but establish themselves with something, and then keep growing, right?
Yeah, and I think that's obviously it's a much easier thing to do, because there are a number of advanced development assets that you can get for, you know, obviously, you know, the ticket is going to be much lower. But there's more, so you have more opportunities to, you know, and alternatives, you know, to choose from. So it's gonna be easier, because when they come, you know, when one of these groups, they first came to us, we were talking to them, Lucho, and remember that, you know, they were saying, oh, we want this and this and this and that. Well, that doesn't exist. I mean, or there's just a handful, and, you know, yeah, we can help you, but just, you know, you need to be realistic and know that this, you know, this in that particular criteria that you were pointing out, with all of those characteristics, there's, you know, there's not 100. But if we change the sort of stage, and you shift some things, and one of the things being an advanced deposit, an advanced project instead of you know, an operating mine, you get a different picture, and we talked about this with them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the advantage of an advanced exploration or advanced development project, Paula, is that you know, the fact of the matter is that when you price those, when you value those assets, you're never going to value them at the current copper price. It's that simple, right? And you know, the seller might have that expectation, but if he has that expectation, he's not going to sell that asset. Period. Not for that expectation.
Yes.
And it's our job to deal with that expectation and to actually talk to the potential buyers. I don't think we should look after this asset because we're never going to reach terms, right? But that's where creativity comes in, and I think that's where knowing the sellers and knowing them well, particularly if they're a private company, and knowing what keeps them up at night in terms of what they want out of this asset. Whether they're willing to take shares, or do they need cash, etc. That's the kind of work that we do that I think adds a lot of value, right? That we can identify assets that are not in the public domain necessarily. That assets that are in the public domain are most likely assets that we know it's in one way or the other, and particularly know the players behind the asset, the stakeholders or the main shareholders behind the asset, and be able to be a bit creative on how to go through, right? I mean, and a good example of that was that copper transaction that fell through. I mean, we were very creative in the way we managed the structure. It didn't work out in the end, but I can tell you that the potential buyer was disappointed, but was very happy with the work that was done.
Yeah. I think the creativity part and sort of and also to be creative, to take that point, you also need to have already a really good understanding of all these different variables, and jurisdiction is, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, part. You really need to understand what needs to happen for this particular asset to actually get through construction and production. So obviously you can't say that you're gonna know every single detail about the world, but you know sort of the steps that need to be, and then each step needs to be fulfilled and everything. But so that's and it's interesting. It's a good fun to do these transactions and talk about deals, and I know you're super passionate about it, and I love having these chats with you about like, oh, and what if we said this, and what if we do this, and what if it's good fun.
It is.
Yeah. All right. I think we've got so we've talked about Lundin Caserones transaction. We talked about First Quantum, and we talked very briefly about the Glencore failed bid. We'll see. I'm gonna keep an eye on that one because I think we may not have heard the last. They're trying to keep it alive, so we may revisit in the future. And it's a big transaction. It's bigger than 23 billion. It's important, I think. But anyway, I think, do you have any other additional comments, or should we leave it there for the next time?
Well, I think we just leave it there for the next time. I do think that it's worthwhile at some point going through that list of 10, 15 projects that the Peruvian government says are going to be coming on stream. I have a list somewhere there that's an official list,
Yeah.
And I'm happy to talk unofficially about the official list. So
no, we can do that, and we can also. I have a similar list for Argentina. We can talk about those, and there's a bunch of copper there, and some of those we did work with, so we know. Even though obviously a lot of things have happened in the past, and one of that was another rumor that we were gonna say. There was this one. We can talk about that in a future one, but there's been a lot of rumors about one particular copper project sort of starting hiring again. So everybody's kind of gearing up for more activity. So we'll talk about that. We can do a sort of 10 best picks or something like that. All right, wonderful. Okay. So we'll leave it there. So thank you very much for listening. If you're still here, thank you, and thanks for keeping up with our chat.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, Paula.
Bye, Lucia.